Eleanor Winters had always dreamed of a more self-sufficient lifestyle, even within the confines of her suburban neighborhood. When she purchased her modest ranch-style home in Oakridge Estates 3 years ago, she carefully reviewed the HOA regulations and found no explicit prohibition against keeping a small number of backyard chickens. 6 months ago, she finally took the plunge and built a tasteful small coop in her backyard, painted to match her house, and welcomed 4 hens into her life. Eleanor took pride in her daily routine, collecting fresh eggs each morning before heading to her job as a high school science teacher. The neighbours on either side of her property seemed charmed by the quiet clucking sounds and often accepted her gifts of extra eggs with delight. She kept the coop immaculately clean, and the chickens were barely noticeable to anyone not directly adjacent to her property. Each morning, Eleanor would rise with the sun, slip into her garden clogs, and make her way to the cedar coop she had built with the help of her brother, a carpenter by trade. The structure was a miniature version of her own home, with a sloped roof, proper ventilation, and even tiny curtained windows that made her smile each time she approached. Inside her 4 hens, Rosemary, Thyme, Sage, and Pepper, created a gentle symphony of clucks and coos that Eleanor found more soothing than any meditation app. "Good morning, ladies," she'd greet them, scattering organic feed across their enclosed run. The chickens had distinct personalities that emerged over the months of care. Rosemary, with her rust-coloured feathers, was always first to the food. Thyme, the smallest of the bunch, hung back until the others had their fill. Sage was the most vocal, announcing each egg with what Eleanor swore was pride, while Pepper, sleek and black, was the best layer of the group. Eleanor had integrated the chickens into her science curriculum, occasionally bringing in their still warm eggs to demonstrate concepts about biology and sustainability to her fascinated students. Several parents had even reached out to ask about starting their own coops, impressed by their children's newfound interest in ecology and food systems. The fresh eggs transformed Eleanor's culinary life. Her breakfast routine evolved from hastily grabbed granola bars to luxurious frittatas with vegetables from her modestly expanding garden. She developed a small but appreciative circle of A clients, mostly elderly neighbours who remembered the taste of truly fresh eggs from childhood farms, and young families seeking to connect their children with food sources beyond the supermarket shelves. Even Walter Jenkins, the retired military man next door known for his gruffness, had softened after receiving his first carton of Eleanor's eggs. He'd shown up at her door a week later with a hand-carved wooden egg basket, a surprisingly delicate creation for his weathered hands. "For your collections," he'd said, before hurrying back to his own property. The basket now hung by her back door, a daily reminder of the small community her chickens were helping to build. Eleanor never imagined these 4 feathered creatures would bring such fulfillment to her life. They represented something beyond the eggs themselves, a small rebellion against the packaged, disconnected modern existence that surrounded her. In her more philosophical moments, sipping coffee and watching them peck contentedly in the morning light, Eleanor felt she had reclaimed something essential that most of her neighbours have forgotten existed. The trouble began on a crisp Saturday morning when Eleanor discovered a formal notice from the Oakridge Estates HOA taped to her front door. The letter, printed on official letterhead and signed by Regina Blackwood, the notoriously strict HOA president, cited unauthorised livestock on her property and demanded removal of the chickens within 7 days. Eleanor was stunned. She had researched the bylaws thoroughly before building the coop. Determined to fight this, she spent her weekend gathering the original HOA documents, highlighting the absence of any chicken prohibition, and drafting a polite but firm response. On Monday morning, she hand-delivered her letter to the HOA office, requesting a formal review of her case. 3 days later, Eleanor received a terse email claiming that while not explicitly mentioned, chickens fell under the General Nuisance Clause. The board would review her request at the next monthly meeting, 4 weeks away. In the meantime, they strongly suggested compliance. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the email still open on her laptop, her hands cradling a mug of tea gone cold. Through the window she could see Pepper scratching contentedly in the enclosed run. The notion that these gentle creatures constituted a nuisance seemed absurd. Not once had a neighbour complained about noise or odour, quite the opposite, in fact. She pulled out the HOA covenant documents she'd highlighted and spread them across the table. Section 4.2 covered pets, allowing 2 dogs or cats. Section 5.7 prohibited large livestock, including but not limited to horses, cows, pigs, and goats. Section 8.3, the General Nuisance Clause, was frustratingly vague, referring to activities causing excessive noise, odour, or visual disruption to community standards. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marjorie Henderson across the street. Saw the HOA vultures circling. Need backup. Eleanor smiled. Marjorie, a retired environmental attorney with a legendary garden, had been Eleanor's first ally when she moved in, helping her navigate the Byzantine rules of Oakridge Estates. Regina's on the warpath about my chickens, Eleanor texted back. Claims they're a nuisance. Marjorie's response was immediate, ridiculous. Her yapping Pomeranian is 10 times louder. Want me to draft something? I've tangled with Regina before. Eleanor considered the offer. She knew Regina Blackwood by reputation, a former corporate executive who treated the HOA like her personal fiefdom. The woman's garden featured nothing but non-native ornamentals, maintained by a weekly service that arrived with blaring leaf blowers at precisely 7 a.m. every Thursday. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. That evening, Walter Jenkins knocked on her back door, his weathered face set in unusual concern. Heard about the chicken situation, he said without preamble. Regina's been threatening cetaceans for my bird feeders for years. Woman's got nothing better to do than make rules. I'm not giving them up without a fight, Eleanor replied, surprised by the intensity in her own voice. Walter nodded approvingly. Wouldn't expect less. Those birds aren't bothering anyone. Pretty sure this is about Regina's new role on the county council. Trying to show she's tough on rule breakers, or some nonsense. Eleanor's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about 4 chickens anymore. It was about arbitrary power and the right to reasonable use of one's own property. She spent that night researching similar cases in other communities, finding numerous precedents where backyard hens had been successfully defended. By morning, she had drafted a comprehensive response citing legal precedents, neighbours' letters of support, including one from Walter that was surprisingly eloquent, and a proposed set of reasonable guidelines for keeping backyard chickens. If Regina wanted a fight, Eleanor was prepared to give her one, armed with science, law, and the backing of her neighbours. Eleanor refused to give up her beloved hens. The following week, she noticed something odd. The eggs in her coop were disappearing. At first, she thought it might be a neighbourhood fox or raccoon, but there were no signs of animal disturbance. The coop remained locked, and only the eggs vanished, not the chickens themselves. Setting up a small camera disguised as a garden ornament, Eleanor was shocked to discover the truth. Regina Blackwood herself was entering Eleanor's backyard each morning while she was at work, using what appeared to be a copy of the community master key that was supposed to be for emergencies only, and confiscating the fresh eggs. The footage showed Regina smirking as she placed the eggs in a small basket and walking away with Eleanor's property. Furious but strategic, Eleanor documented this trespassing and theft for several days. She approached her neighbour Marjorie, a retired attorney, who confirmed this was illegal regardless of any HOA disputes about the chickens themselves. However, before taking legal action, Eleanor decided a different approach might make her point more effectively. On Wednesday morning, Eleanor collected her usual 4 eggs, one from each hen, before leaving for school. When she returned that afternoon, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The latch on the coop door was slightly misaligned, as if hastily closed. Inside, the nesting boxes were empty, though Sage had definitely been settling in to lay when Eleanor left. "This isn't right," she muttered, running her fingers along the edge of the nesting box. Her chickens were consistent layers, and she'd come to know their schedules intimately. The sudden absence of eggs couldn't be natural. That evening, Eleanor installed a tiny wildlife camera she used for her ecology lessons, concealing it inside a decorative birdhouse with a perfect view of the coop entrance. The next morning, she pretended to leave for work at her usual time, but doubled back through Marjorie's yard, slipping into her own house through the back gate. At precisely 9:15 am, the sound of the side gate latch clicking made Eleanor freeze. Peering through the blinds, she watched in disbelief as Regina Blackwood, dressed in a tailored pantsuit that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly mortgage payment, strode purposefully across the lawn toward the chicken coop. Regina glanced furtively at the surrounding houses before producing a key, unmistakably the master key that HOA board members were supposed to use only for utility emergencies. The woman unlocked Eleanor's coop with practiced ease, reached inside, and emerged with 2 fresh eggs that she placed delicately into a monogrammed basket. Eleanor's hands shook with anger as she snapped photos through the window. The absolute audacity of the woman. Not only was Regina trespassing on private property, but she was also stealing, all while pursuing official action against Eleanor for keeping the very chickens whose eggs she was taking. That evening, Eleanor reviewed the wildlife camera footage, which had captured the theft in perfect clarity. Regina's smug expression as she closed the coop was particularly infuriating, the look of someone who believed rules applied to everyone but herself. "This explains why she's so determined to shut me down," Eleanor told Marjorie over a hurried cup of coffee. "She's been helping herself to my eggs all along." Marjorie's attorney instincts were immediately engaged. "We've got her dead to rights on trespassing and theft. We could file a police report, or take this to the full HOA board." Eleanor considered this, but shook her head slowly. "I need to think bigger. Regina's politically connected. She'll find a way to spin this or minimize it." "What did you have in mind?" Marjorie asked, recognizing the determined glint in her friend's eye. Eleanor smiled, a plan already forming. Something that makes a statement she can't ignore or wash away. Something that sticks. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor documented Regina's repeated egg thefts, building an irrefutable case. But instead of immediately confronting her, Eleanor began researching materials in her science lab after school hours. If Regina Blackwood wanted Eleanor's eggs so badly, she would make sure the HOA president got eggs she'd never forget. Drawing on her background as a science teacher, Eleanor devised an ingenious plan. She carefully emptied several eggs, creating tiny holes that were nearly invisible, and then filled them with a mixture of washable blue food colouring, cornstarch, and water, a concoction that looked exactly like egg whites and yolks, but would burst dramatically upon impact. She placed these doctored eggs in the coop one evening, positioning them precisely where Regina typically took them from. For good measure, Eleanor shifted her camera for a better angle, ensuring she would capture whatever happened next. That night she barely slept, anticipating the morning's events with nervous excitement. Eleanor's classroom laboratory became her secret workshop after school hours. With the precision of a chemist, she selected 6 perfect eggs from that morning's collection and carefully prepared them for their new purpose. Her students often joked that Miss Winters could have been a mad scientist in another life, if only they could see her now. "This is for rosemary, thyme, sage and pepper," she whispered as she worked, using a syringe to extract the actual contents of each egg through a pinhole so small it was nearly invisible to the naked eye. Years of conducting delicate science demonstrations had given her steady hands. The formula she created was a masterpiece of everyday chemistry. Food-grade ingredients that would cause no permanent damage, but would certainly leave a memorable impression. The blue food colouring was professional grade, vibrant and concentrated. To this, she added a precise amount of cornstarch to create viscosity similar to egg whites, along with a binding agent that would ensure the mixture wouldn't simply wipe away with a casual swipe of a hand. "The perfect consistency," Eleanor murmured, holding one of the refilled eggs up to the laboratory light. From the outside, it looked completely ordinary, a beautiful fresh brown egg from Pepper, her most reliable layer. Inside, however, was Eleanor's special surprise. That evening, she enlisted Walter's help, explaining her plan while they shared iced tea on his back porch. "You're sure the camera angle is right?" he asked, an unexpected twinkle in his eye. Shame to miss the moment. "Adjusted it myself. Full view of the coupe entrance and the path to the gate," Eleanor confirmed. "And I've got 3 days of footage showing her previous thefts for backup." Walter nodded approvingly. "Woman's been needing a lesson about boundaries for years. Used to think my military career had strict rules until I met Regina and her tape measure. Last summer she cited me for hedges 2 inches above regulation." Eleanor carefully transported her special eggs home in a padded carrier. As darkness fell, she placed them strategically in the nesting boxes, making sure they were positioned exactly where Regina would reach for them. The genuine eggs she collected that evening went into Eleanor's refrigerator. She wasn't going to waste good food in this endeavour. As a final touch, Eleanor repositioned her wildlife camera for the perfect angle, testing its motion activation several times. She added a second camera hidden in a different location as backup, wanting to ensure she captured the moment from multiple perspectives. Before heading to bed, Eleanor took a moment to visit her chickens, who clucked softly in the darkness of their coop. "Ladies," she told them gently, "tomorrow we defend our home." Eleanor barely slept that night, her mind racing with visions of what morning would bring. She had always been a rule follower, someone who respected authorities and systems. But there were principles worth fighting for: the right to responsibly use your own property, the sanctity of personal boundaries, and perhaps most importantly, standing up to bullies who abused their power. Tomorrow would be about all 3. The next morning, Eleanor left for work as usual, but circled back and parked down the street, watching from a distance. Right on schedule, Regina appeared in her pristine white pantsuit, master key in hand. Eleanor held her breath as Regina unlocked the gate, strode purposefully to the coop, and reached in for the eggs. What happened next exceeded Eleanor's wildest expectations. Regina placed the first fake egg in her basket, but as she reached for the second one, she fumbled slightly. The egg dropped just a few inches onto the others and burst with spectacular results. Bright blue yolk exploded across Regina's immaculate outfit, hands, and even spattered her perfectly coiffed hair. Regina's shriek could be heard 3 houses away. In her panicked attempt to clean herself, Regina knocked over the entire basket, detonating the remaining fake eggs in a cascade of blue splatters. The camera captured everything: Regina's trespassing, the egg explosion, and her subsequent meltdown as she realized she was covered in evidence of her unauthorized entry and theft. Eleanor watched from her car, hand pressed over her mouth to stifle her reaction. The morning sun was just breaking over the rooftops of Oakridge Estates as Regina Blackwood's world exploded in shades of brilliant blue. The HOA president stood frozen for a moment, shock evident even from Eleanor's distant vantage point. The white pantsuit, which Eleanor recognized from Regina's campaign photos for county council, now bore a spectacular Rorschach pattern of blue splatters. One particularly vivid streak ran from Regina's shoulder to her hip, while smaller droplets decorated her arms and chest like avant-garde jewelry. Then came the panic. Regina looked wildly around the yard, clearly terrified of being discovered. She abandoned the basket entirely, blue liquid still dripping from its sides, and made a frantic dash for the gate. In her haste, she slipped slightly on the dewy grass, adding a green stain to complement the blue disaster of her outfit. Eleanor ducked down as Regina rushed past her parked car, not wanting to be seen. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of the woman's face, a mask of humiliation and fury, now decorated with tiny blue freckles where the egg contents had splashed. Regina's carefully styled blonde hair bore the distinct evidence of her crime, with several strands now sporting a turquoise tint. Once Regina had disappeared down the street, Eleanor waited a full 5 minutes before approaching her own property. The scene at the coop was even more dramatic than she had anticipated. Blue splatter decorated the path, the side of the coop, and even one of her garden gnomes now sported a jaunty blue cap, where a droplet had landed perfectly atop its pointed hat. "Oh my," came Marjorie's voice from over the fence. Eleanor turned to see her neighbour peering over with undisguised delight. "I heard the most interesting scream this morning. Sounded almost like someone was being murdered by a smurf." "Imagine that," Eleanor replied innocently, though her twitching lips betrayed her. "You don't happen to have seen Regina today, have you?" "Not yet," Marjorie said with a wink. "But I hear there's a county council photo session at 11. Would be a shame if she couldn't make it." Eleanor carefully retrieved her cameras, hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. She felt a curious mixture of emotions, vindication, certainly, but also a strange sort of pity for Regina. The woman was undoubtedly humiliated, caught literally blue-handed, in an act she couldn't possibly explain away. As she downloaded the footage to her laptop, Eleanor was stunned by the clarity of the images. Every moment had been captured in high definition. Regina's furtive entry, the casual theft, the moment of fumbling, and then the glorious explosion of blue that transformed the prim HOA president into a walking piece of abstract art. "Worth every minute of preparation," Eleanor whispered, watching the sequence again. She had no intention of publicly humiliating Regina. That wasn't her style. But having this evidence gave her leverage she hadn't possessed before. Perhaps now they could have a real conversation about reasonable HOA regulations and the proper use of master keys. The video of Regina's blue-stained misadventure was never publicly shared, but Eleanor did present it at the next HOA meeting, after sending Regina a private copy with a note suggesting they discuss a reasonable resolution. The meeting was unusually well attended, as rumours had somehow spread throughout the neighbourhood. When Eleanor calmly presented documentation of the repeated trespassing and theft, alongside her original research showing no prohibition against chickens, the other board members were visibly uncomfortable. Several homeowners spoke up about Regina's overzealous enforcement of arbitrary rules, sharing their own stories of harassment. By meeting's end, the HOA board voted to create explicit guidelines for small backyard chicken coops, with reasonable requirements focused on cleanliness and noise control. Regina, still finding traces of blue dye in her hair weeks later, resigned from the board citing personal reasons. Eleanor's chickens remained, now fully sanctioned by new HOA guidelines. She became something of a neighborhood celebrity, hosting small workshops on urban chicken keeping and sustainable living. And if residents occasionally mentioned blue eggs with knowing smiles when Regina walked by, Eleanor would simply change the subject, though she kept the surveillance video safely stored in the cloud, just in case. 2 days before the scheduled HOA meeting, Eleanor invited Regina to meet at the local coffee shop, neutral territory for what promised to be a difficult conversation. Regina arrived 15 minutes late, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that couldn't quite hide the lingering blue tint at the ends. "I have exactly 20 minutes," Regina announced without preamble, sliding into the booth across from Eleanor. Her usual confidence seemed dimmed, replaced by a brittle defensiveness. Eleanor simply slid an unmarked envelope across the table. "I thought you might want to see this before the HOA meeting on Thursday." Regina's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and found a USB drive inside. "What is this supposed to be?" "Just some neighborhood wildlife footage," Eleanor replied mildly. "I've been documenting visitors to my property. It's quite illuminating." Understanding dawned on Regina's face, followed quickly by anger, then something Eleanor hadn't expected: fear. "You set me up," she whispered. "No," Eleanor corrected, keeping her voice level. "I protected my property from theft after documenting multiple intrusions. I simply made the eggs memorable." Regina glanced around the coffee shop, suddenly aware of curious glances from other patrons. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice strained. "Money? To humiliate me at the meeting?" Eleanor shook her head. "I want reasonable chicken regulations added to the HOA guidelines. I want you to stop using the master key to enter people's properties without permission. And I want an end to the arbitrary enforcement that's been making everyone's lives miserable." The conversation that followed lasted far beyond Regina's 20-minute limit. By the end, a compromise had been reached. Regina would support new guidelines for backyard chickens with reasonable restrictions, and Eleanor would keep the video private, though both women knew it remained a powerful bargaining chip. The HOA meeting that Thursday was standing room only. Neighbours who had never shown interest in community governance packed into the community centre, drawn by whispered rumours of what would be discussed. Eleanor had prepared a comprehensive presentation on urban chicken keeping, complete with data on noise levels, far below those of permitted dogs, waste management, and property value impacts, neutral to positive in communities with clear guidelines. She never needed to mention the blue egg incident directly. Regina's uncharacteristically subdued demeanour spoke volumes, as did her surprising support for Eleanor's proposed guidelines. Walter Jenkins and Marjorie Henderson led the community questions, steering the conversation productively whenever it threatened to derail. When the final vote was tallied, 28 in favour, 3 against, a spontaneous round of applause erupted. Eleanor's chickens would stay, and more importantly, a precedent had been set for reasonable, evidence-based community standards rather than arbitrary restrictions. As the crowd dispersed, Regina approached Eleanor stiffly. "I've submitted my resignation from the board," she said quietly, "effective next month." Eleanor nodded, recognizing this for the peace offering it was. "Your organizational skills will be missed," she said diplomatically. A ghost of a smile crossed Regina's face. Perhaps, but I think Oakridge Estates is ready for some fresh eggs and fresh perspectives. By summer's end, 3 more backyard coops had appeared in Oakridge Estates, each one following Eleanor's carefully designed guidelines. She hosted weekend workshops on sustainable living that grew to include vegetable gardening and composting. The HOA, under new leadership, began focusing on community building rather than restriction enforcement. And if the neighbourhood children whispered stories about the mysterious blue eggs that had changed everything, Eleanor neither confirmed nor denied the legends. Some lessons, she believed, were best learned through stories passed down, like the timeless reminder that even the smallest creatures can inspire magnificent change when someone cares enough to protect them.